Welcome to Better Bazaar Builds, and today's topic is a long-awaited answer to the top meta threat. How do we deal with Dooley and his raise? Before we determine the builds themselves, we must first know the strength and weaknesses of raise. In our last video, we discussed some strength regarding finding consistent wins on the ladder and positioning in the meta. Before the build itself, raise really only have one strength. They will kill you sooner or later. No amount of healing can deal with how much poison the strongest poison builds apply, and no amount of armor can deal with how much burn the strongest burn builds apply. That is, eventually. There is no outlasting raise, there is only killing it before it kills you. The only other strength that the build has is decent disruption. Beta Ray will freeze the small items while the commonly run LEDs will deal with builds with large items. Given the ramping damage, the Ray builds are generally strong in the early game when fights are longer, and very strong in the mid game when the ideal Ray and ideal damage source are combined. Let's take a look at the types of Ray builds that exist. In the S tier, we have Companion Core plus Monitor Lizard, and Ignition Core with mixed weapons like Missile Launcher and Flamethrower. These are the premier forms of poison damage and direct damage. In the A tier, we have Ignition Core with burn items like Soldering Gun. It's more consistent than the other Ignition Core, but slower in damage, so it often serves to transition into Flamethrower later into the game. Also in the A tier is a Pylon and LEDs that was popularized by Crip recently, and that I personally want to try more of. The Ray build often has no haste and relies solely on the charging mechanic on the core, so Pylon adds some much needed haste for more frequent casts, and also takes advantage of the commonly run LEDs. Next in the B tier, we have builds using Rays and the basic core, which has the benefit of being able to charge Rays or important damage items on the other side. The double core build with combat core is also in B tier. Both these builds are usable when you get given the right items but don't have the high roll damage numbers of the builds above. And lastly, in C tier is builds focusing on just the weapon Ray, usually using multicast weapons and the weapon core, as well as armored core or crit core being run with Rays. The synergy to deal damage is just not as high, and these builds are even somewhat stallable. Let's take a look at two example builds, Monitor Lizard and Ignition Core. Other than their overwhelming damage, there are some pretty glaring weaknesses. Since 6 to 7 slots are already taken up by the core, the Rays, and the damage item of choice, there isn't room for much else. The builds are lacking significant armor or healing, the Ignition build is lacking haste, and the Monitor Lizard build is lacking slows. The main form of disruption of Beta Ray also only freezes small items. The build is also very susceptible to disruption itself. Slowing or freezing the core is devastating since it slows down the scaling of all the damage items, and disrupting either the Rays or the damage item is terrible as well. And while Monitor Lizard's effect can't be frozen or slowed, the friends that charge the core can. We've mentioned ad nauseum how good the in-fight scaling of Rays are, but there's another type of scaling we haven't discussed too much yet, the scaling of the build throughout the days. The ways that build can scale with days are through adding enchants, upgrades, adding new items, buffing existing items with loot and events, skills, and lastly, inbuilt scaling in items. All builds scale well with enchants and upgrades, but Ray builds in particular take advantage of them. The upgrades on the Rays are some of the strongest upgrades on small items, and enchants can allow an item to take advantage of multiple Rays, like a fiery Monitor Lizard, for example. However, these are also the least consistent ways to improve your build. More importantly though, Ray builds are relatively fixed. Because Ray builds have 6 to 7 core items, they are less able to become stronger by improving to stronger items. While other builds are swapping out their items for stronger ones as they become available in later days, the Ray builds sometimes go multiple days without significant changes to their items. For monster loot and event buffs, Ray builds scale well with cooldown reduction, but less well with flat damage scaling. After the early game, so much of their scaling is during the fight that a +1 damage buff doesn't really matter. Lastly, Ray builds also struggle to take advantage of many skills. Skills often reward having a mix of items. Many skills require having a large item, many skills reward having a mix of items, but when your Ray build is all small and medium items that do a similar thing, there can often be skill vendors where you have to take a suboptimal skill. And skills make up a majority of the scaling past day 8 or 9, so not being able to take advantage of a wide variety of skills is a major downside to Ray builds. Is there anything we can do to take advantage of these weaknesses? Well, the first thing to realize is that there's no way to beat all Ray builds. Some will always hit their breakpoints too early, or some will find skills or enchants to make up for their weaknesses or exacerbate their strengths. But hopefully those builds will win and remove themselves after day 10. Our goal is to find builds that can consistently deal with the majority of Ray builds the majority of the time, especially after the mid-game. Alright, let's combine everything we know. We need a build that can deal direct damage quickly to take advantage of the low survivability and before the Rays are scaled. We shouldn't have important small items that can be frozen, but we also shouldn't only have a few large items that can be slowed. We also want disruption of our own to reduce the speed that Rays builds scale at. Ideally, we'd also have a bit of armor to slow down burn builds or some healing or lifesteal to hold off the poison builds. Lastly, we want builds that we can pivot into in later days to take advantage of Ray's weaker late game, and we want to be able to pivot into them from mid-game builds that can contest at least some of the Ray builds during their power spike. Or we want super strong early game builds that can kill him quickly before he assembles his build. Let's start with Pig, since Pig's naturally high health bars are hard countered by the ramping damage that Dooley has. First, we'll take a look at some builds that don't work. The Uwashi Wally builds don't work since they forgot about the number 1 rule of Rays. You can't outstall the king. Even as the best consistent healing build in the game, they don't heal enough, and you'll only maybe able to pick up some early wins with a strong build and weight. Another build that some of you may be surprised to see on here is Spiky Shield. Spiky Shield rose as an early counter to poison builds, when both Pufferfish and Monitor Lizard were around, and you would be correct. The Spiky Shield build does have a good matchup into poison, but burn builds have started increasing in popularity, and while shields should counter burn damage, the burn damage is also what prevents the shield from staying and allowing Spiky Shield to deal damage, which allows the Rays to scale. Okay, now that we know what doesn't work, let's take a look at what does. The first answer people think of is Crook, and that would be correct if we pretend we can't see corrosive toxins. But regardless, Crook and Adladdle is the best and most consistent answer to Dooley, and you just have to accept that you'll lose some diamond corrosive toxin games. Actually, with Caltrops, you should still win most of the time, as you watch Dooley stab themselves before the Caltrops damage is lowered too much. A second popular answer is scaling damage items like Beast of Burden and Regal Blade. These answers make a lot of sense. They scale well throughout the run as Rays start to fall off later, and they are hard-hitting first hit attacks. The consistency on the scaling of these items has been hit a bit by the most recent patch notes, but if you're able to find early upgrades, then it's a good answer. Another answer that many point to as a surefire way to deal with Dooley is max health builds. And again, they would be correct, but only after a certain point. Double Whammy and Lion's Cane are hard-hitting first attacks, and max health builds have some of the best scaling in the late game. The problem is that making it through the mid-game against Ray builds is difficult before you accumulate enough max health to one-shot them. So one way to play this build would be to have a different build in the foreground during the mid-game, while scaling up your pawn shop in your inventory, and then transitioning late into the game when you've stacked up your pawn shop enough. And lastly, the least consistent but possibly strongest build of them all, the Scraper builds. A fully assembled Scraper build beats pretty much anything out on the market, so it is a little like saying the strongest predator in the forest is an AR-15, but I did have to mention this build for completion. Just be sure your Scrapers have some enchants or way to deal with free skills once the raid builds start to pick up on those, since you'll only have 2 or 3 active items. Vanessa is a natural enemy of Dooley, and this still holds true despite the various nerfs that Vanessa has faced. Particularly rising in popularity are single weapon builds, such as Cutlass or Flagship. The lifesteal helps in holding off raid damage for a bit, and the builds are fairly consistent to acquire. Not only are single weapon builds strong in the early game, they also scale especially well into the late game, and can start one-shotting Doolies once skills with charge like Alacrity, Flurry of Blows, and Bloodhound are acquired. Boards with Burn, especially the most consistent one with Trebuchet and Water Wheel, are also fast and direct damage. Lastly notable is to take the Tent City Mayor fight every time it is offered, since augmented weaponry can enable a variety of Vanessa builds that are very strong into Dooley. There's nothing special about Vanessa builds that counter Dooley, Every current meta Vanessa build relies on fast damage and should already have a good matchup into Dooley except for the mid game. The only advantages are ways to tech against Dooley, which we'll get into later. Believe it or not, the best way to beat Dooley is in fact Dooley. It's simple. The worst your odds are can get is 50%, and that's if you are the average Dooley player. Any improvements or thought put into your build, which the average Dooley player doesn't have, should put you above. One of the hardest matchups for poison builds is Burn. Burn procs twice as fast as Poison does, and the poison boards have a hard time fitting in survivability. So Burn beats Poison in the damage race. If you play the Burn Dooley deck, you should be coin flipping versus other Burn Dooley decks, and win almost all the time against Poison Dooley decks, making your overall win rate 75%, assuming Burn and Poison have the same play rate. But let's say you would rather die a self-righteous hero than win and climb as a meta-abusing villain. Well, Dooley isn't the best for fast and direct damage, but he certainly still has some options. My personal favorite is to run Dinos. It destroys the rays themselves as a nice benefit, but more importantly, Dinos are direct damage that scale throughout the run. As rays fall off, Dino continues to boost their damage numbers after every fight. By the super late game, a crit from a fully scaled dinosaur is enough to one-shot most Doolies. In fact, one of my most common strategies is to run Companion Core with Monitor Lizard to get me some easy wins in the mid-game. Then, if I don't have enough wins overall to close the game out quickly, I'll look for Dino to begin scaling it for the late game. Another build you can run with a Companion Core are the Weapon Friends. Usually one or two of these fellows along with some support. But this build is pretty weak and usually relies on a lucky enchant or skill to power up the weapons to be viable against other builds. Other than the Companion Core, another viable direct damage build is Combat Core. Combat Core suffers from a similar fate as Rays, that they fall off after a certain time. But an early upgraded Combat Core is actually faster in damage than most early Ray builds. If you don't have a core suited to either build, you could always opt for a coreless build, usually powered with a large item that provides haste, like Solar Farm or Pylon. Solar Farm in particular is good as a burn build that can sometimes outspeed Rays. Of course, these items can also be run with cores as well. The actual greatest benefit to using Dooley to counter Dooley is that you are playing Dooley. If you find early Rays, you can just play Rays. Or if you find early items to build a counter build, you can play the counter build. Either way, you can more consistently find a strong build or have more options to fall back on if and when you miss. Overall, if you're struggling against Dooley, here are the builds you should have in mind for each class. They're not the most innovative ideas. Most of these builds have already begun picking up popularity on the ladder to counter Dooley. But going through this exercise should let you realize what types of builds counter Dooley and help you evaluate if your current build will perform well against him. Of course, there are no perfect answers and you will still lose to Dooley, a lot. But knowing these builds well allows you to build them when you come across a good opportunity to, and pick up some mostly free wins against the Doolies out there. Even though you should keep these builds in mind, it doesn't mean you have to run one of these builds. In this game of multivariate rock, paper, scissors, a strong paper beats a weak scissors, and the strongest rock crushes them all. But then again, a moderate scissors with a backup paper should beat a moderate rock. You may assemble a different build that is extremely strong against everything except for Dooley. Or you may find yourself with a great Beast of Burden build with Lifesteal that specifically struggles against some specific Dooley variants. The answer is to have tech items or skills against Dooley. On that end, I went through literally every item and skill in the game to find some good examples that you can include in your builds. The strongest tech items are the ones that increase cooldown: Chrono Barrier, Atomic Clock, and Fort. These are particularly good against Rays since the charging ability of Freeze Rays and the core don't care about slow, but they are majorly impacted by cooldown increase. Chrono Barrier is especially good in the Dooley versus Dooley mirror, and I've often taken out a major damage item like Rocket Launcher to put in Chrono Barrier when I'm facing another Dooley. Another option is Item Destruction. You know that Dooley will be running small items, so you could run Harpoon, Dinos, or Dam. It's not my favorite option since all of these choices are quite slow. By the time you destroy the items, you could already have 500 poison on you, and the Dooley could care less at that point whether he still has the Ray or not. But it can help if you have free slots, especially in the early game when the Rays don't scale as fast yet. Next is Disruption. Dooley casts a lot, so items that trigger on enemy item cast are all quite strong. It's often difficult to fit these items into a build, but again, these can be good to fit in some free slots or as an option to switch in against Dooley. The last and arguably best options are Void Shield and Caltrops, which deal burn or damage on each enemy item cast. Caltrops is usually run with Crook, and Void Shield usually with the Burn Ray or with Solar Farm, but it could be strong if you have a bit of scaling and you want to be favored in the Dooley matchup. Regarding skills, let's first talk about Petrifying Gaze. It sucks against Dooley. By the time you're at half health, you already have all the poison or burn stacks on you, and freezing all the opponent's items is not going to help remove that poison or burn. Any skill that says when you drop to half health or when your opponent has more health than you are not useful. Similarly, any skill that scales throughout the course of the fight will not scale as fast as rays do. That doesn't mean they're useless. For example, building Crescendo, the one that gives you crit chance on item cast, is still one of the best skills in the game. But it does mean that you should prioritize ramping skills less. The skills you want are the ones that say, the first time you do X, have some effect. I've already mentioned it in the Vanessa section, but they are too good not to mention again. That Alacrity, Flurry of Blows, and Bloodhound skills are the best against Dooley. Other first-time effects, such as Invigorating Freeze or Neophiliac from Dr. Vortex, are great as well. An auto-take skill is Bonk, but you can specifically take more fights against the Thug instead of the usual furthest right monster if you're struggling against Dooley. Since many of the builds that counter Dooley rely on big weapons and need some survivability, skills that give lifesteal, like Big Ego, Circle of Life, and Quality over Quantity, naturally synergize. Especially strong with big weapons are Frozen Shot or Hypnotic Drain from Death Knight Reaper. There are also specific skills that target non-weapons, which are 95% of Dooley items being run. These being Assault Focus, Blizzard, although it's currently bugged, and Glass Cannon. If you specifically have trouble into the burn variations of Dooley rather than the poison ones, you can look for Burn Containment, Cauterize, or Stout Fire, especially early on when there are fewer selections for good skills that you want. And just for completion, the auto-include and often auto-win skills are Desperate Freeze and Fiery Rebirth. Alright, that was a lot, but hopefully all of this can improve your matchup against the dreaded Dooley builds. The current meta is already shifting against Dooley, and more of the decks mentioned here are popping up. Our next video will explore whether there is a build that has good matchups into both Dooley and the anti-Dooley builds. Other than that, thanks for watching. Before you leave though, one thing I would like is what types of videos you want to see. Do you like longer, in-depth meta-analysis videos like this? Or shorter videos that focus on one particular item or build, like my previous videos? Also, would you be interested in gameplay videos? Either full uncut runs or cut highlights of my runs. And lastly, is there any type of shorts content that you would find interesting? Please leave suggestions on this since I want to know what type of content to produce in the future. With that, this has been Porpoise, and until next time, build better.